Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing with you Spellbinders Clubs for September. This is a nice autumn themed club. Here is the clear stamp of the month, and it is called Autumn Wishes. I absolutely love the image as well as the different sentiments they have with it. Then there is the Spellbinders Glimmer of the Month. This one is Friendly Thanks. It has the large scripted thanks plus a die to cut out that thanks and then some sub-sentiments to go with it as well. Absolutely beautiful. So I'll use that in a few cards today. This is the Stencil of the Month, Color for Pumpkins, perfect for those fall backgrounds. There is 4 different layering stencils in this set, and I love all the different, 5 different layering stencils in the set. And I love being able to color those pumpkins in different colors. I'll be using that in 2 different cards. And then we have the 3D embossing folder of the month. This one is Pumpkin Patch, so perfect for fall and autumn cards. These 2 die sets I won't be using in this video. I'll be using it in the next video about the clubs. This one is the die of the month called Autumn Scarecrow, and then the last one is the large die of the month called Picture Perfect Autumn. Absolutely beautiful. I love all the different additions and options that they have in those die sets. So many different ways you can get creative with them. So for my first card, I'm going to use the clear stamp of the month. I just couldn't resist that image. I was just in the mood for doing some watercoloring this day. So I'm going to stamp and emboss the image, and then I'm going to watercolor it with some distress reinkers. Now, anytime I get a brand new stamp, I take a white eraser and I erase or I rub on the stamping surface of that stamp, and then use a soft brush to remove any eraser bits. This helps the stamp to take ink a little bit better. And when I've done it for one image in the stamp, I know that I've done it for all, because anytime I use one image, I just do the entire set so that I know that everything is ready to take ink. So I'm going to use the image, plus I'm going to use a sentiment on here. I'm using some Spellbinders watercolor paper. I decided to use my Misties to make sure that I have perfect placement and I can double stamp it and make sure that that image is exactly where I want it to be. Now, I had originally placed the stamp or the sentiment stamp a little bit lower and then decided I wanted to use the space a bit better, so I raised it. And I love the grid lines on the front of my Misty to be able to do that and to make sure that it's nice and straight. So I'm using some Versamark ink to emboss this. I like to emboss when I'm using or when I'm watercoloring for 2 reasons. First of all, I like the different texture that it gives. It gives a nice raised kind of glossy texture. I'm going to be using some gold embossing powder. I figure this would be perfect for fall cards, but I love the look that you get with the embossing in combination with the watercoloring. The other reason why I like to emboss when I watercolor is then I don't need to be quite as careful about making sure different areas are dry before watercoloring beside them. By having that embossed edge, it kind of gives a bit of a ridge, and it's almost a little bit of a safety net when I'm doing some embossing. So I decided to do some more embossing, and these pieces I'm going to be using on the inside of my card. I used another one of the sentiments, plus there's a little oak leaf sprig with some acorns that I wanted to hang off the top. Basically, I just loved both of the images in this set, and I thought it would be too cluttered to do just them on the front of the card. So I thought it would be nice to have that also on the inside of the card as well. When we have enough things on or in a stamp set that you want to use, I always love to make them or to incorporate them. Now, you could easily take this image and turn it into a second card if you didn't want to have that on the inside of the card. I just chose to put it on the inside because I thought it worked well, and then added the Happy Thanksgiving for the inside of the card. So this one I embossed as well with that gold embossing powder. I like when it coordinates with the front of the card. I like to use distress reinkers for watercoloring because the color is very nice and bright, but if I add just a little bit more water, I can mute that color or lighten it. So I like to have the control over that. I'm going to start at the back of the image. I'm using some bundled sage reinker here, and I'm just doing a little bit of coloring behind the image. I want to do this first because then I can color different areas on top of that, and I don't need to worry about trying to be extra careful once my image is completely watercolored and worrying about the colors that are in those areas. Now I start right behind the image and then I kind of feather it out so it blends it out, almost looking like a little bit like ink blending, but I'm doing it with a water brush, and by starting right beside the image, that's where I get the brightest or the darkest of the color, and then I can fade it out. I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending around the entire image once everything is done, but I always love to have some shadow or something behind it when I start. I did wait for that to mostly dry before I'm starting to work on my image here, and this is one of the pumpkins. I'm doing this with carved pumpkin distress refill. The name was just too perfect for it, so that's what I'm doing. I have distress watercolor or distress palettes. These are, you can use them with your distress reinkers. You can use them with alcohol inks as well. I have all the different distress refill colors in them, and then I put a label at the bottom right of each little well to show what is in there. Now some of the colors you can tell what's in there. Other colors are just so dark that it's really hard to tell exactly what the color shade is. So by having that label, and I just watercolored quickly over top of it to know the shade of the color, it just helps me to pick and choose exactly which color I want to use. I've had this one for years and have been using it for years. Refills or distress refills do not dry on this plastic, so this needs to be stored horizontally. So this is not something that you can fill the different colors in, they will dry up and you can store vertically. You have to store this horizontally, otherwise everything's going to run out. Now, when you use refills for watercoloring, they last a long time, they go a long way, and I love knowing that my refills have an extra use to them. So for the red areas here, I'm using some candied apple, nice bright apple color. And I'm doing the same thing or same technique for pretty much every area. I put my water brush in the color and I start where I want that color to be the darkest and then blend it out. Now I have a water brush that has water right in the handle. It makes it really easy to be able to blend that out, to add a little bit of extra water. You just squeeze it a little bit. I also have a piece of paper towel to my right that I will regularly go in, clean off the tip of my brush to take some of that excess color on or clean it off for the next color. To clean my brush off, I just squeeze it a little bit, have the water flow through those bristles, and it cleans the color out, and I'm ready to go to my next color. Now you don't necessarily need to have a brush like this. You could have just a water brush and a jar of water. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz, so if I have a jar of open water on my desk, there's a very good chance I'm going to spill it. So I have had this brush for many, many years. I use it all the time, and it's one of my most favorite tools, especially when I'm doing some watercoloring. So I'm blending in the different areas here. I'm also using some peeled paint reinker. If I miss a color while I'm speaking, I'll have everything listed and linked down in the description below, so all the different colors that I'll be using are there. Sometimes when I'm creating, I'm thinking I'm going to know exactly which one I'm using, and then while I'm doing the voiceover, I second guess which one I'm actually using. So basically I'm using a bunch of different colors for a fall palette here, and really it's just personal preference what colors you're using. Some of the colors I chose because of their name. Carved pumpkin is one of them. It was just perfect for the pumpkins. And then candied apple, it seemed like obvious for the apple, and then for some of the other accents. So there's not really a right or wrong when it comes to the different shades. It's just personal preference. Now, I am not a huge fan of orange and yellow, and I've said it about the yellow for sure before. I'm not sure if I've said it about the orange. However, I do love fall color palettes. I love when the leaves start to change. I live in an area where we have mostly evergreen, so we don't get a lot of seeing the different fall colors. We get a little bit, but not as much as some areas. So I really love seeing it in pictures, and I also love being able to create it in my craft room when I'm doing watercoloring and whatnot for different fall cards. So I like to play around with that. When I have some of those leaves there, I start with one of the colors. I blend it out so there's very little color for the rest of the image. And then I will take the different colors I want for my fall leaves and I'll just kind of dot it in. And because those areas are still damp, the colors start to blend and flow into each other. And that's how I like to create fall leaves. And if it doesn't blend quite as much as you're wanting, I will clean off the tip of my brush, or I'll clean off the tip of my brush, and then just with a damp brush, I'll just kind of help that along a little bit. I make sure to not have any color on my brush because I don't want to muddy the colors. When you go from green to red, it's really easy to end up with brown. So I try to have a clean brush to make sure that I can mix those colors without adding any additional color to it. So you can see I kind of jump around my piece here a little bit. I will start at one area, and then I will jump around to a different one. And I'm always moving my piece. My brush is always pointing to where I want that color to be the darkest, and then I will blend it out towards the lightest. So I find it easiest to do that by having a piece not mounted on anything or loose on my craft desk that I can easily turn and spin, and I'm not working over top of my image. If I were working over top of my image, my klutz tendencies would come into play, and there's a very good chance I would dip my hand into something that was wet and then smudge it somewhere. So by being able to move it around, I can make sure that my hand is always on a dry area or a clean area, and not to accidentally put my hand on anything that is wet and colored. So I'm letting my piece for the front of my card dry, and I'm working on the image for the inside. This is a very simple image. It just has two different oak leaves as well as the acorns. I'm doing the same method here for the leaves that I did on the front of my card. I will start with one color, blend out or make the rest of the leaf a little bit wet, and then I will go gradually lighter. So for the first leaf, I went from green to yellow to orange to red. For the second leaf, I did it the opposite because I already had red on the brush. I started with red and then I went to orange and then yellow, just kind of dotting a little bit of green in there. And you can see that I keep going back to my paper towel, drying things off, as well as cleaning out my brush before blending it out. For the brown part for the acorns, I'm using Vintage Photos. I also use Squeeze Lemonade for the yellow, and then for some of the orange areas I use Ripe Persimmon just for a little bit of color variation from the carved pumpkin. While I'm waiting for those images to dry, I'm going to emboss that pumpkin patch embossing folder. I'm using some Persimmon cardstock, and I did mist my cardstock to make it damp so that would, really move or really press into the nooks and crannies. Now, one thing I'm going to do for several of the cards, or all of the cards in this video, is I'm going to add a little bit of interference ink. Now, I've used these many times before in videos. They are some of my favorites to use because they have a different look on light than they do on dark. But even on the light, you see a little bit of the mica shimmer from the color that is supposed to show up on the dark. So I'm using Pumpkin Patch here, and I am using it to watercolor. You can watercolor with these. They are a dye pigment blend, but you can absolutely watercolor with them. So what I am using for this one is Pumpkin Patch. Pumpkin Patch has orange dye, so that's what you see on the light color, but the interference property of it is purple. So when I'm done with the watercolor, where I have that ink the darkest in my image, you're going to see just a hint of that purple shimmer. So it's just going to add a little different texture to the watercolor and just a glint or a hint of shimmer. For the greens, I'm using Summer Garden. Summer Garden looks green on light cardstock, and then it has blue interference properties that you're going to see when you tilt it into the light. I'm also going to be using these same ink pads to do just a tiny little bit of ink blending around the edges, just to tie that in a little bit and be able to see the shimmer there. And I'm doing light because I don't want to detract from my image. I want to enhance it. Now, if you have the re-inkers for these pads, you could use the re-inkers instead. You could create a palette with the reinker colors, and I do plan to do that at some point when I have them all. For these particular colors, I think I have the Summer Garden one, but I didn't have the Pumpkin Spice one yet. So it's easy enough to just use your pads, smush them out onto a non-porous surface, and then use that as your paint palette. So if you don't have reinkers and you want to watercolor with them, very easy to do. Just smush them onto a non-porous surface, a piece of plastic, a piece of packaging, a glass surface mat, and then use your watercolor to brush with that. Now, I did a little bit of ink blending on my background here, mainly because I wanted to see how it was going to look. I also wanted to tie in a little bit of that interference color, but you're really not going to see much from this embossed background on this card. It was more just to add the texture behind my image, but you're only going to see just a thin little bit of it. So these pads you can do easily, or you can easily do ink blending with them. And they look lovely. I absolutely love those pads. They're like magic in a pad. So before assembling my card, I'm going to cut down my watercolored piece. And you may notice that as I did that, I put my finger on one of the images, and the image itself was dry, but some of that color had gone on the embossing. And because embossing isn't porous, it didn't dry on there, so I had some wet areas. So the way to avoid this is actually take a clean piece of paper towel and just put it over top of your watercolored piece and just kind of lightly press. It's going to take any of that reinker off of your embossing and make sure that you don't do what I just did. It's an easy fix though, because if you happen to do that, just take a clean water brush and watercolor it out. You're not necessarily going to get the entire color out, but you're going to lighten it significantly. And because I already plan on doing a little bit of ink blending around this anyways, it's going to get completely hidden, but I wanted to include that in here just so that I remember to tell you exactly how to fix it if that happens to you. Sometimes it happens and there's no way to fix it. You really have to start over again, but a lot of times there are ways to fix it or ways to hide it. So before starting to assemble my card together, I am going to do that ink blending around. So I'm using distress ink pads in Carved Pumpkin, and then I'm also going to use Bundled Sage before I come in with those Cloud 9 interference pads. I'm using my Altenew sticky mat to help with that ink blending. I love the fact that it grips my cardstock for me, and I can just concentrate on the ink blending. I don't have to hold my paper down and worry about that at all. I do clean off my mat between each and every piece just to make sure I'm not going to get any contamination. I have some microfiber cloths that I have a damp one that I use to wash things off, and then I have a dry one to dry it. So for my inside piece, I'm once again going to do that ink blending. I'm starting with the Bundled Sage. I'm just using some large ink blending brushes to get it done really quickly here. And then I'm going to go and do the Carved Pumpkin on the bottom left corner, just to tie in the colors from the oak leaves at the top right corner. It's going to tie in the colors from the front of the card. You could, if you want, do just the Bundled Sage all the way around it. You don't necessarily have to do the two different colors, but I love the look of the two different colors, especially with the different fall leaves that we have on both the front as well as the side. So now that the front piece has dried a little bit, I'm adding just a little bit of deeper color with the Candied Apple Distress Pad. I did this on the inside of the card as well. I found that just the orange wasn't quite enough color, and I wanted to incorporate some of the deeper colors as well. So I just added a little bit of that Candied Apple. And now that those distress inks are done, we can clean off our mat, and then we can incorporate some of those Cloud 9 interference inks. So I have ink blending brushes that I have dedicated to each one of these colors. I used a label maker to make a label for the handle. I don't like to mix and match the different brushes with the different pads. You definitely want dedicated brushes for these pads. And by labeling them, I know exactly which pad each brush has been used with. Now you could, if you didn't have enough brushes, you could rinse them off and have them dry for your next project. I don't necessarily want to do that, so I have brushes for each of the colors. So once the inside is done, I can do the same thing for the outside. I'm going to just use the pumpkin spice pad, and I'm doing very light ink blending. All I want here is just to see a little bit of that interference color, and you can see it a little bit when you tilt it to the light. It doesn't show as much on camera as it does in real life, but it perfectly complements the slight little bit of that interference mica color that you can see in the watercolored image, and it just enhances it. It adds a little bit of shimmer, and I think it looks beautiful. So with all of our pieces done here, we can start assembling our card. I just have a white card base here. My pumpkin patch piece was cut to the same size as the card, so that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and then my watercolored image piece is cut down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. So like I said before, you're only seeing a tiny little bit of that textured piece, not even enough to know that it's pumpkins, but I wanted just that texture around the outside. For the inside piece, I have a mat here cut to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8. I wanted to have it almost as big as the inside of the card, but I didn't want to interfere with the fold, so it's just slightly smaller. My watercolored piece is cut down to 4 inches by 5 1/4, so I get that orange mat around the outside. For my next cards, I wanted to use the glimmer sentiment. So I'm taking out my glimmer machine and I'm going to do some hot foiling. I'm going to do it several different ways so that I have lots of choice when it comes to creating for the next cards. So while I have my glimmer machine heating up, I'm going to try some glimmering on vellum. I'm also going to do some on hammermill cardstock. I'm using some rose gold foil as well as some matte gold foil. And I'm cutting my foil to the size of my hammermill cardstock. I'm going to use, for each one, I'm going to use the large thank sentiment plus one of the sub sentiments, putting them on the glimmer machine with the image side up, then putting the pretty side of the foil down to it, and then whatever cardstock I am foiling to, press the timer button, and once that timer button goes off, I can put that stack through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. You need both the glimmer machine for the heat and the die cutting machine for the pressure. So here's the foiling on vellum. Now you're not going to get a perfect pristine image on vellum because it is a little bit textured, but it has a beautiful look to it. It almost has a little bit of a distressed look to it. So I tuck that to the side, and then I'm using the rose gold foil on hammermill cardstock. Once again, press the timer button. Once that goes off, I can put the whole stack through my die cutting machine. And then we have a beautiful image here as well. For any overfoiling, I will use a piece of Best Ever Craft tape that I have taken some of the excess stickiness off and use that to lift some of it up. And I'll also use a sand eraser. For my next piece, I'm using some of that matte gold foil again, once again with hammermill cardstock, and then stacking them together, pressing the timer button. Once again, once that's done, putting it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. And I will also do the solid hot foiling as well. I always like to use up the foil if I can at the same time. And by doing the solid hot foiling, I get double the sentiments. And it also gives you more options when you're creating. You're going to get the complete opposite look. And sometimes that looks better on your background than the regular hot foiling. So it's nice to have a solid hot foil plate to be able to do that with. The stacking is exactly the same. The only difference is instead of those glimmer plates, I'm using the solid hot foil plate, putting the foil, the pretty side down, and then the cardstock on top, and then the plates. Again, once that timer goes off, I run it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine for the pressure. So before I do any die cutting, I'm just going to take some of the excess overfoiling. There's not a whole lot here, but you do want to do it before die cutting. It's just going to be a little bit easier. So I go first with the Best Ever Craft tape because that's the most gentle, and then I will use my sand eraser. You don't want to use that sand eraser over top of any foiling that you want to keep because it's going to change the look of it. It's going to change the finish and the texture. So be very careful with that. You're doing it outside of your actual foiled image. Then I can take the coordinating die set, lay it on my image, and I like to tape it in place just to make sure that it's not going to shift on me, and I will die cut all of my thanks sentiments. So with all of my foiling and die cutting ready to go and set to the side, I can start doing the rest of my card. So I have some beeswax cardstock here. I'm using some temporary adhesive just to hold it in place in my embossing folder. And then I am inking the other side of that embossing folder with some bundled sage distress ink. This is going to add that color to the background and some of the creases in the pumpkins. It's going to make those images pop just a little bit more. I do find that this needs to be done a couple times to build up that color and get a more even coat. The very first layer is always really, really splotchy. And as you do it a little bit more, it evens out just a little bit. It does build the color up. So if you're not wanting something super dark, you want to start with a lighter color and have it build. If once you're done, you find that the color isn't as dark as you want, you could always do it again with a darker color. But I always like to start lighter because you can never take the ink away. You can always add a darker color, but you can never take the ink away. Now to color in my pumpkins, I'm just using an ink blending brush and coloring in with some carved pumpkin distress ink. I'm only doing this lightly. I'm going to go in with some of the interference inks over top of this. So I just want to get kind of a base coat of color. I started without my sticky mat and figured I had to bring in that sticky mat just so that it would hold that piece in place while I was doing the coloring. That way I can concentrate on the color a little bit more. I am trying to make sure that the color is a little bit heavier towards the base of the pumpkin and where it goes behind either another pumpkin or behind one of the sunflowers, just to give it an area that is a little bit lighter, has a highlight, and an area that has some shadow to it. So for my sunflowers, I am using some Fossilized Amber Distress Ink. I'm going in with a detailed ink blending brush for this because it's a much smaller area. So I am starting at the center or the base of each petal and just kind of flicking my way out. Once again, I'm doing this very quickly. I'm not doing a lot of detailed ink blending here. Again, a base of color. I'm coming back in with some interference ink as well. So this is just a base of color just to add a little bit of depth and dimension. Once those sunflowers are done, I'm using the bundled sage distress pad with a detailed ink blending brush and just adding some of that green color to the center of the sunflowers as well as the stem below them. Again, very quick and light. I'm not doing a lot of detailed or precise ink blending here. If I wanted to be precise, those areas are so tiny, I would probably need to use like a Tombow marker or something like that to get some precise looks in there. This is just for some color. Once I have those three colors down, I can start doing my interference on top of it. So this one here, I'm using pumpkin spice. I'm starting at the base of the pumpkin and just kind of flicking or brushing my way up. I want the concentrated color to be at that base. So that's where the interference shimmer is going to come in play. You'll see it on the whole pumpkin or anywhere I put the ink when I tilt it to the light, but the majority of it is going to be at the base of the pumpkin where the darkest color is. Now I'm just using a regular ink blending brush here, but you could use a detailed ink blending brush if you wanted it to be a little bit more detailed, or if you really wanted to get some darker color towards the base of the pumpkin, that would work as well. For on the sunflowers, I'm using some lemon candy interference ink. This one has a yellow color to it, but the interference color is kind of a pinky corally color. So that's going to go well with the oranges in this background as well. I'm using a detailed ink blending brush for this because the area is such a small area. I want to make sure that I can get in a little bit easier. And same as the Fossilized Amber Distress Ink, I'm starting at the base of the flower, the base of the petal, and kind of flicking my way out. Again, I'm just getting a little bit of color here. I'm going to have a little bit of that interference towards the base of the petal, towards the center of that flower as well. You can add as much or as little of the ink colors as you want. And I love the look that the shimmer gives this. For the greens, I'm using that same Summer Garden. So this is going to have the green color and the blue interference. I'm using that same, or it's using a detailed ink blending brush. And I'm just using a little bit of this color because it's such a small area. My detailed ink blending brush here is a larger one, so I'm just kind of using the edge of the brush so that I'm not adding too much color or getting that color where I don't want it to go. Once I've done the middle of the sunflowers, the base of the stems, I can also do the stems from each one of those pumpkins, get those a little bit more highlighted as well. Now, all of this ink blending could be done with just distress ink blend or ink pads or regular ink pads. You don't necessarily need to use that interference, but I just love that extra shimmer that it gives. And I love the fact that the shimmer is something that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So now that that is ink blended, I can cut that background down. I'm going to use a strip for the sub-sentiment, and then I have my die cut thanks to go on top of this. I am going to glue these to the front of the pumpkin piece before adding them to my card because I want to be able to trim down this strip. I want to be able to center it, trim it down before putting it onto the background of my card. I am using Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle to do my gluing. That way I can use it for large pieces or small pieces. By using a liquid glue, I have a little bit of wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place. I like to put a large acrylic block on it just to hold everything flat while it's drying. I give that glue about a half a minute or so to really start to set and start to grab, and then I can take my scissors and cut everything down. With that all ready to go, I can glue that to my card base. Now, because I'm gluing a embossed background, I want to make sure that I'm using ample glue. So I go all the way around the edges, and any of the areas that are recessed or going to touch my card base, I make sure that those have glue on them so that it is gluing down that background well. I did trim that pumpkin piece down, so I trimmed it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. And here's my background. You can see the beautiful shimmer you get when you tilt it into the light. For my third card, I'm using the stencil of the month. So this is the Colorful Pumpkin stencil. I'm going to start with the stems just to make sure that it makes it a little bit easier to line up all of my different pumpkin layers or my different stencil layers. These stencils have numbers on the bottom left-hand corner, so you know what order they're intended to go in, but you can really go in whatever order you want. They also have registration marks that line up perfectly with a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece of cardstock. I'm just doing my ink blending on hammer mill cardstock. This will work on whatever cardstock you like to do your ink blending on. But by doing the stems first, when I go to layer on my next layers, I can make sure that those stems line up perfectly with those pumpkins. So it's a great way to do it. Once again, I'm using the Altenew sticky mat. It holds down both my cardstock and my stencil as well, so I don't have to tape anything down. For my next layer, I'm using some Fossilized amber. I am concentrating the base of my color, or the dark part of my color, at the base of the pumpkins. So that's where I start my color, and then without adding any more ink to my brush, I will do the rest of the pumpkin. By doing this, I'll get a little bit of a shadow at the base of the pumpkin, and it just gives it a little bit more interest rather than having just a solid layer of color. However, if you like the look of just a solid layer of color for this, it will absolutely work just fine. I love the fact that you can, use these stencils however you like them. Now, I'm just using distress inks for doing this ink blending today, but you could also choose one of the layers and add like a textured paste or a glossy, like a clear glossy texture paste over top of one of your pumpkins just to add a little bit of extra shimmer. You could even use Versamark ink and do some embossing. Now that third color was Carved Pumpkin. Now I'm going to go with some Spiced Marmalade. Again, doing the base or the darkest of the color at the base of the pumpkin. Some of the pumpkins there have kind of a top profile. So that first one there, I did the dark part of the color all the way around the edge before going in and filling in the rest. And I'm going in a counterclockwise as well as clockwise motion so that I don't get a concentration of ink towards one side of the stencil. I can make sure that it is concentrated kind of evenly over everything. My last color here is Rusty Hinge. This is a nice kind of a dark rusty orange color, and these colors all blend together beautifully. I love the fact that there are so many different yellows and oranges here for the pumpkins because they come in so many different colors. It's fun to play with that. So with this background done, we can start assembling a card. And that came together really, really quickly thanks to that sticky mat holding my paper in place and not needing to tape anything. So I'm going to cut this piece down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I have a piece of Persimmon cardstock here that I'm gluing down, or that I'm cutting down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. So I'm going to glue down that stencil piece to the mat, and then I'm going to glue down my sentiments and sub-sentiments. So for this one, I'm going to use my solid hot foiled sentiment and sub-sentiment just for a little bit of a different look. This one has the gold one. Again, you could use whichever one you're wanting. I didn't think the rose gold would work well with the colors in this background. I thought it was a little bit too much of a pink tone, so the gold works absolutely perfect. Another thing that you could do to tie in that gold is on one of the layers of the pumpkins, you could take a gold ink pad and do just a little bit of ink blending around the outside of it, or even do the full pumpkin gold to tie that in. I think that would be really, really cool as well. Even a layer with some glitter paste would be fun on top of distress ink, just to add a little bit of that extra sparkle. So by having stencils, you can get creative with some of the layers. I kept it very, very simple for this card, but for the next card that I'm doing here, this is the fourth card, I'm going to get a little bit more creative. So I'm going to be using those interference ink pads for this one here. And I absolutely love doing this technique with interference pads. I start with a black soot distress pad. I use a detailed ink blending brush for this particular layer and concentrate that ink where I want my color to be the darkest. This technique, I've used it many times in my interference videos, so if you want to see this used with other images, go look at that playlist. You'll be able to see more inspiration there. I'm starting off with the stems once again, so I put that black ink where I wanted to see the interference color or where I wanted some shadow. Then I used my dry microfiber cloth to clean off all of that black ink off of the stencil because I don't want to contaminate my interference pad. And then I went in with the Magic Garden interference pad. That is the one that's going to show up green on white cardstock and blue on black cardstock. So when you look at it close up, you see the green on the white cardstock, and then you see the blue interference on over top of that black ink. So I'm going to do the same technique for each and every one of the layers. For the pumpkins, though, I used a little bit larger brush just to make it go a little bit faster. So I'm concentrating that black color at the base of the pumpkin, and then I just kind of sweep it up just a tiny little bit to get a little bit of a gradient blending. For this layer here, for the interference pad, I'm going to use that lemon candy. So this one is going to show up yellow on the white cardstock, and then on the black areas, it's going to have kind of a pinky corally interference color. So you're going to get a really unique look with this, and it just highlights both properties of these ink pads. Another thing you could do, and I didn't do this in this video, I might do it in the future, is just use these stencils with these interference pads on black cardstock, and then only you would only see the interference color to it because you wouldn't see any of the dye properties on black. Because dye inks are transparent, they don't show up on black, which is why you can't use just plain distress pads on black cardstock. You would never see it because the dye base or the dye inks are transparent and the black shows through. So that first layer there with the pumpkins was done with lemon candy. This one here I'm going to do with ripe mango. I'm going to start exactly the same way as the other two layers. I'm going to go in with my black ink pad, putting a concentrated amount of that black at the base of the pumpkin and then blending up slightly. Then using my dry cloth, cleaning off my stencil, and then I'm coming in with that ripe mango. So ripe mango, it looks yellow on the ink pad cover, but it's kind of more of a yellowy orange color, almost like a school bus color. And the interference color to this is green. So you're going to see a yellowy orange at the top of the pumpkin where it's on top of white cardstock. And then when you tilt this to the light on the black ink, you're going to see more of a green color. So this just creates, once again, a very unique look to it. You can see a little bit of that shimmer when I lift it up and tilt it to the light, but really it's nothing like you see in person. You see so much more in person, and it just has so much more of a wow factor in person. So for this next layer here, once again, starting with that black ink, and you can see how quickly this goes. Even that extra step of adding that black ink and cleaning off the stencil doesn't really take too long. After I clean off my stencil, this layer, I'm going to do the pumpkin spice. So this one is going to show up more orange on the white cardstock, and on the black ink, we're going to see more of the purple interference. I'm using a detailed ink blending brush here only because I don't have a larger ink blending brush for this particular pad yet. I'm waiting for some more ink blending brushes to come in the mail. I've got them on order. They're in transit right now. So I'm using a detailed ink blending brush. It works exactly the same as the larger brushes. It just takes slightly longer. Now I lay these stencils out to my side, and once I'm done all the different layers, I'll go wash them off. This ink washes off the stencils super easy. It just rinses off in water. I don't need to use any cleaner at all. So there's no worry about not being able to get them off your stencil or having to do it really quickly. I wait until everything's done. It's not going to dry on your stencil, and like I said, I just rinse it under some water, no cleaner needed. It comes off really easily. So once this layer is done, there's one final layer to go. So I'm going to repeat the same steps for that. I'm going to position the stencil in place, and these are really easy to line up. And I found that by doing those stems first, it makes it really easy to layer every single one. And I don't have to layer those pumpkins and hope that the stems all line up at the end. It worked out perfectly this way. So once again, going in with that black ink, and I use Black Soot Distress ink. You could use whatever dye-based ink you want. You could even use a permanent ink if you want, but that is going to be more difficult to get off of your stencil. And I don't find that using the interference over top of this rehydrates that black ink or smears it in any way. For this last layer here, I'm using Warm Chestnut. So this has kind of a brown mahogany look on light cardstock, and on the black ink it's going to have a bluey purple interference. So it has a really cool look and perfect for fall. I love using this color for fall projects because to me it just looks like fall. Just the dark orangey browny mahogany color is absolutely perfect. So once this is done, I can take my stencil off, and while I'm letting the inks dry, I go and clean them off. The inks really don't take that long to dry, but you will find that as they dry, the interference or the mica shows so much better after it's had a moment or so to dry. So I can trim that down. I trimmed that one down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and then I'm trimming down a black piece of cardstock to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I'm taking that right mango pad and I'm just swiping it along all of the edges. This one is going to be the mat around that piece. You could do this technique on white cardstock or black cardstock, but I wanted to see that mica as a mat around it. And by just swiping that color around the outside edge, I'm not wasting any more ink than I absolutely need to. You don't need to have ink on the center of it because it's going to be covered, it's not going to be shown. So there's no point in wasting that ink in any way, shape, or form. I do let that dry for a few minutes before assembling my card though. For this particular one, I decided to assemble them onto my card base before adding my sentiment and sub-sentiment. When I do these sub-sentiments, I keep the pieces long so that I can center it or place it how I want. Then once that has dried for a few moments, I can easily trim off the excess. So for this one, I have a glimmered sub-sentiment, but if you saw my sentiment, my thanks here is negative hot foiled. So I see the gold around the outside and the thanks itself is just the white of the cardstock. So you can mix and match regular foiled with solid hot foiled sentiments really easily, and it looks really cool. So that gold works perfectly with those interference colors, and I love the final look of it. You could even do some ink blending on that large thanks piece if you wanted with some of those interference colors and add that to the sentiment as well, but I didn't really find it was necessary. So here are all the cards created with the first half of the Spellbinders Clubs for September. My next video will have the 2 die sets used for some cards as well. So join me for that as well if you want to see those ones used. I can't wait to start playing with those. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.